All right, we will get started and then let more people in as we go. I'm Patrick Krisak. I'm the Director of Faith Formation and Missionary Discipleship for the Archdiocese of Boston. I'm joined this evening by your wonderful guests and Rosemary Mathey from our Faith Formation and Missionary Discipleship team, and Everett Fritz from Andrew Ministries. Everett has been doing youth ministry in parishes and in cooperation with dioceses and other organizations for 18 years. And he lives in Colorado with his wife and his three children. He just came from Alabama today, where he was filming some Life on the Rock episodes. As I mentioned, we're partnering with Everett. He was with us in September, speaking to priests as well as to many of you and to other ministry leaders about vision for youth ministry, focused on really intentional accompaniment and small groups. And he's specifically working with, I think it's 7 collaboratives now. So I'd have to check to see how many parishes, probably a few more parishes than that in the Archdiocese of Boston. And we don't have more spots with Everett, but we are in the process of pairing other parishes for coaching with Life Teen and Young Life and Y Disciple as well. And with that, I will turn things over to Everett. And Everett, if you want to, there's a Q&A and a chat. I don't know if you want people to, raise their hand or unmute if they have questions or put them in the chat. You tell them what you'd like.
Oh gosh, I haven't thought that far ahead. So I'll say this: I'm going to leave a fair amount of time at the end for Q&A.
Sounds good.
So that because I love to talk practicals and love to just get into the kinds of questions that people have. But let me kind of lay the framework. And if you really have a question that is burning, just interrupt me, I guess. Or no, yeah, actually, it would probably be better post it in the chat, and we'll
Okay.
see if we can get to it. But yeah, thank you, Patrick. Thanks. I'm excited to do this webinar with you all. Small group ministry is my passion. I tend to consider myself or call myself a small group guru. Um, I feel like that's my full-time job is just talking all things small groups. So I wanted to talk. I mean, if small groups are not a part of your ministry, I'm going to make try to make a strong case for why small groups tend to be foundational in terms of what we do in youth ministry. When I was a student at Franciscan University of Steubenville. I transferred in my junior year, so I was participating in freshman and transfer orientation, and it was amazing to me as a college student. Everything about orientation there on that campus, and they had hundreds of students they were getting oriented. There was small groups for everything. We had a small group that we were in as part of orientation, and then we had a small group that we were in for introduction to our dorms, and there was a small groups, and then like in the first few weeks I would go to different presentations or and they always broke into small groups, and it actually got to a point where I found it really annoying. And I remember saying to somebody there at campus, I said, do they ever not break into small groups? Like, I feel like if I as an introvert, uh, if I said, I feel like if I were to die and go to hell, like the first thing they would say is, okay, we want to introduce you to your small group here in hell. So it's like, but I look back now and realize the genius of why they did what they did is they wanted every student to feel welcome, B, students to make connections with one another. And really, by the end of the week on campus, I knew quite a few new students in my dorm, in respective like theology or catechetics departments or different things. I knew students around campus that I didn't previously know. Like it was a really fast way to get people oriented and connected with one another. And so like everything was done in small groups. And uh, the reason why I lead with that is that like if you're not doing small groups as part of your youth ministries or your ministry with young people, I'm going to make a case for why you should. Now, if you've been at my presentations in September in Boston, a little bit of this in the beginning is going to be repetitive just because I want to bring everybody up to speed. But um, if you know like what my passion in youth ministry is not just that I love working with young people. It's that I believe that the way in which we're doing things with young people is ineffective. If you look at Christus Vivit, which was a document that came out shortly after the Synod on Young People, it was the apostolic exhortation given by Pope Francis, kind of the takeaways from the Synod on Young People that happened in, I think it was 2019. Um, I pulled out this one quote, although there's a lot of stuff in there that is gold. I recommend reading the document. But he says, youth ministry, as traditionally carried out, has been significantly affected by social and cultural changes. Young people frequently fail to find in our usual programs a response to their concerns, their needs, their problems, and issues. The reason why I pulled that out is because I love that the word in there that he uses. He says young people fail to find in their typical programs, uh, like that their needs are being met, that their problems and issues are being met. I was just, as Patrick mentioned, I was just in Alabama filming for EWTN, where we were talking about youth ministry in the church, and I said the question came up in some of the interviews that I was doing. Why are young people leaving the church? And I said, look, there's a lot of reasons why. It's a spectrum of issues. But if I were to kind of cast an umbrella over why young people are leaving the church and try to summarize it in one statement, I would say it's because the church isn't meeting their needs. So needs being the key word there. There is nothing magical about small groups. You can do small group ministry and actually be ineffective at it. But what I love about small groups is it tends to be one of the best places or best environment to meet the needs of a young person. And the reason why I like the word like meeting the needs of a person is because Abraham Maslow had this theory of psychology known as the hierarchy of needs, where he says that if a person's basic needs are not met, they don't move to a point of self-actualization. So for our purposes working in ministry, the self-actualization step that we want a young person to get to is that we want them to become a lifelong follower of Jesus Christ in His church, which that's a self-actualization step because when they're raised with their parents' faith, or it's their priest's faith, or their catechist's faith, or their teacher's faith, or whatever the case may be. We want them to get to a point where they say, the faith that I have is not my parents' faith, but rather it's my own faith. That's a step that they've made in terms of a personal decision themselves. Now, according to Maslow, a person doesn't get to that point unless their basic needs are met. So he says, like, just give you an example of this. Instinctually, if you were stranded on a deserted island because of a crash, you're the only survivor. According to Maslow, instinctually, your first thought is not how do I get off this island. Maslow would say actually that your first instinct is to say I need food, water, fire, shelter, and and then once those basic needs, because those are basic needs, and then once those basic needs are met, you would move to a point of self-actualization, which is how do I get off this island? So it's the same thing in ministry with people is that how do we, what are the basic needs of a human person? Well, young people have a need to be understood. They have a need for belonging. They have a need for transparency around faith and beliefs. They have a need for critical thinking being the key word there. It's not just instruction of the faith, it's that they have a need to wrestle with and question and dialogue with regards to teachings of the faith. And then they have a need for guidance. I would consider those basic needs. And so, according to Maslow, if a basic needs of a person are met, they will get to self-actualization. So we have to create an environment where young people in the church feel like they are understood, feel like they're heard and listened to, where they feel like they belong, where they feel like they have somebody they can go to and actually talk about the crosses that they carry, where they can be inquisitive, and where they can receive guidance. And so that's really, for me, the purpose of youth ministry is to kind of get to that point. And the reason why I like small groups is because it creates an environment where those basic needs can easily be met. In a large group event, it's easy to make a kid not feel like they belong, but rather be a number in the crowd. In a classroom environment, you're not necessarily engaging them on a level of you are understood, you feel belonging, you're creating transparency and guidance, etc. In a small group where there's a dynamic where discipleship can happen, um, you create an environment where those basic needs can be met. Now, I use the word discipleship. What is discipleship? Discipleship is a hot buzzword in the church right now, and it actually drives me crazy. I'm glad it's a hot buzzword in the church. What drives me crazy is that it is frequently a word that is misused. Discipleship is not a catch-all phrase for all things service or catechesis or evangelization, which I was at a parish. I'll give you an example of a time I saw it misuse the word. I picked up a bulletin because if I'm visiting a parish, I love to see what the parishes are doing in ministry. And they had a section that said discipleship opportunities. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like my passion is discipleship. Let's see what they're doing for discipleship. And it said, underneath the opportunities, it said, join our choir or become a lector or become a Eucharistic minister. And I was like, those are not discipleship opportunities. That's not even remotely close to what discipleship is. Um, Discipleship is a method of formation that was used during the time of Jesus, and it was very specific in what it was intended for and how it was executed. So during the time of Jesus, rabbis would go into a graduating class of students, and they would handpick a small number of students and essentially give them the opportunity of a lifetime, which was to study under them as a rabbi. And so they would say one of two things to those who were they were selecting. They would either say, "Go and learn the trade of your father," which means that you were not selected, or they would say, "Come and follow me." And if they said, "Come and follow me," you had the opportunity of a lifetime. And so, what uh, studying under a rabbi wasn't book study; it wasn't instructional study. It meant that you would go and you would live with the rabbi, and you would learn from his way of life. So you would learn from the way that he did things, the way that he said things. You would observe the way that he taught. It was very much about imitation, observing, and apprenticeship. And so it's small in nature because he would have handpicked a few people to live with him and to learn from his way of life. This is a concept in ministry that has largely been lost in the Catholic Church, and something that I advocate we need to return to. That it's not enough to simply instruct people in the teachings of the faith. That we actually need to go a step further and say, like, the faith is something that has to be lived, and in order for it to be lived, it needs to be observed. And in order for it to be observed, that means we have to open our lives to people and allow them to see the way in which we live. Um, so I love small groups because it creates an environment where discipleship can happen, where you actually have people like. Uh, and now I will say first off and foremost that Catholics are tend to get into small groups and not do discipleship. One of my least favorite things that I see is the movement towards video studies, where it's like we're going to meet in a small group and we're going to press play and we're going to watch this video and then we're going to discuss. Okay, fine, but if the video study is longer than a few minutes and is anything more than just giving you something to talk about, then the video study is actually taking the place of what is supposed to be happening, which is dialogue and discussion and sharing of one's life with one another. Um, so it's uh, it, we need to get back to this idea and concept of the faith is something to be observed. I'll give you an example of how this is lived out. One of my favorite stories is a man by the name of Jan Tyranowski, who I believe had a tremendous impact um, on the 20th century, and he was just a regular, run-of-the-mill, pious, holy man of God that was in the pews. Uh, and his cause is actually open for canonization right now, and is being observed. Now, what I love about Taranowski is, again, he was a tailor. He was just a pious, holy man of God. His personal spirituality was that of Carmelite spirituality in particular. He loved St. John the Cross, and he loved Mary and the Rosary. We know that because well, he's famous or becoming his story's becoming more well known because when the Nazis invaded Poland, uh, and they shut down all youth movements and really all gatherings of people because they realized that if there was going to be a rebellion, it would likely come from the young people and it would come from gatherings of people. So it became illegal for youth groups to meet in parishes, which were generally run by the priests in the parish. Tyranowski saw a need. He saw that people were suffering. He saw that young people needed guidance, and so what he did is he handpicked uh, a few people and he invited them, young adult men, about five, 20, 21-year-old, 22-year-olds, and he said, come over to my house for dinner. And he would have them over to his house for dinner on a weekly basis. and they would just share life together. They would eat together. They would talk about the sufferings. They would comfort one another. He taught them to love Carmelite spirituality like he loved it, and he taught them about Mary and the Rosary. And then eventually, he challenged these young men to start mentoring younger high school boys as well, to do the same thing for the younger high school boys that he was doing for them, all in small groups, because small groups couldn't be arrested. Uh, and eventually, 60 young boys ended up in these youth groups, these small discipleship groups that were meeting. They became known as the Living Rosary. One of the original five that Jan Ternowski mentioned was a young man by the name of Karol Wojtyla, who is Pope St. John Paul II. His papal mantra was Totus Tuus Maria, because he had developed a great love for Mary and the Rosary, which he developed that love because of Jan Ternowski. His theological doctoral dissertation he wrote on the spiritual works of Saint John the Cross, who he learned to love because of Jan Ternowski. A priest that was ordained alongside of John Paul II said that it, he said Ternowski's influence on Wojtyla was gigantic. I can safely say if it were not for Jan Ternowski, neither myself nor Wojtyla would have become Catholic priests. Uh, so, I mean, there was this reality that, like, this small group met during a pivotal moment in this young man's life. Uh, Ternowski allowed these young men to observe his life and his piety, and in doing so, he actually formed a great saint who had a tremendous impact on the world in the 20th century. So, like, small groups are, um, again, they present this great opportunity for discipleship. If you look at Jesus and what he did in terms of the impact he had on the world, he spent the majority of his ministry time with the 12 that he handpicked, and he said, "Come and follow me." And he was the greatest rabbi ever. And I mentioned um, this idea when I was out in September that I said, I have long wondered what it was like for the apostles to observe how Jesus brushed his teeth in the morning. Like, what did dental hygiene look like for God? How did he fold his clothes? I'll share a story. Like, I was praying one time with the gospel passage of the resurrection of Jesus and John's account, which one of the things I love about John's gospel is that he tends to put in little details and nuggets of information that seem um, strange. Like, they just kind of stand out. Like, he'll put in a piece of information that will say something like it was 12 o'clock in the afternoon, or 3 o'clock in the afternoon or something. And you're like, why did John go through the trouble of telling us what time of day it was? But then if you actually study and dig deeper, there's actually like a deeper message behind what he's trying to tell you. So I was doing Lectio Divina with John's account of the resurrection story, where the apostles come to the tomb. And there was a nugget of information that I found really interesting where he talks about what the laundry looked like in the tomb. So he takes a moment to explain that the burial cloth was on, I think it was either on the ground or it was on the slab of, uh, of rock where the body should have been. But he said that the head cloth, because there was a head cloth that would cover the face, was folded up in the corner and placed somewhere else. Uh, and I just found that nugget of information interesting. And then, as you know, with Lectio Divina, when something stands out to you, you tend to pray with it. I got to the end of that passage, and it says that the apostles looked in the tomb and they saw and they believed. But then, if you keep reading along with the gospel passage, the apostles had no idea what was going on. So I was like, well, what did they believe? I mean, they clearly didn't understand and comprehend, oh, Jesus has resurrected from the dead. Now all these different things make sense. Uh, Everything that Jesus said to us about how he was going to resurrect it, it all makes sense now. They didn't know and understand that in that moment. I was like, so what was it that they saw and they believed? And the Lord said to me in my own Lectio Divina, he said, go back to the burial cloth. So I started to pray with it. And I was like, well, what was the significance of this? And uh, and I realized in reading this, and what the Lord told me in Lectio essentially was, the headcloth was folded up in the corner and it was placed in a spot. And um, I was like, okay, Lord, what is the significance of that? And he said, they lived with me. What he said to me in prayer was, they lived with me for 3 years. And because of that, they would have known the way in which I folded my clothes. Um, and what I realized in that is that there was like a message that he sent in where he placed the burial cloth, or where he placed the face cloth, which was essentially saying to the apostles, "I am alive." And so it's this kind of amazing moment of realization that I was like, oh, like there are things that you observe about somebody's life that you can only observe by seeing it lived. Um, and so there's this message that he's left for the apostles that I am alive, essentially await further instruction. I like that's the concept that I want to get people back to um, is that we need to give ourselves an opportunity for people to actually build relationships with actual practicing Christians and see and observe the way in which they live their life. So I'll take that. I think I've drilled that in probably to death, especially if you were at my presentations in September. It's this idea. Discipleship is about observing the way people live. So then, how do you do that? How do you facilitate an effective small group? I'm going to refer to something that is given to focus missionaries when they are trained. Focus missionaries, when they receive training, Fellowship of Catholic University students. So they do small group ministry on campuses in college campuses, universities. Uh, they tend to try to keep things really simple so their missionaries can just focus on what is most important. And they teach their missionaries 3 words. When you're working with somebody and ministering to them, you need to win, you need to build, and you need to send. So, what are you doing in small group ministry or when you're only working with a handful of young people? Win the relationship, build them up, send them forth. Win the relationship. What does that look like? So, I spend almost all of my time in small group ministries. And when I was first starting to experiment with small groups that would meet exclusively as their own group, that would meet with a mentor for like an hour and a half, I gave in the first year that I was experimenting with this, I gave the teens that I felt like were really ready to take the next step in their faith, and I gave them to my core members, my adult volunteers, my leaders, who I felt really confident in. And I said, here, lead a small group with these guys, and I'll give you some direction on it. Then I took a group of punk teenagers that were being forced to come to my youth group because their parents were devout, practicing faithful Catholics, but they were not. They were forced to be there. And what I wanted to see was if I work with these young boys, these teenagers, um, can I, like, will this method of ministry, small group ministry, actually work with them? So they were the biggest group of punks I've ever worked with. And if I knew how hard-hearted they were, I would have not have given them to myself. But so background on them. Most of they were all really good friends with one another. They had all attended Catholic schools. Their families were faithful Catholics, and these boys were determined not to allow their parents to force their faith upon them. And so they were the most hard-hearted young men I have ever met. And I started meeting with them weekly over the course of a semester. And so all throughout, really the end of the fall semester, and then all through the spring semester, I worked with them doing Bible study with them, trying to experiment with different programs. We met, but I'll tell you, by the end of the spring semester, I was ready to give up because they liked the small group, but because more or less they liked hanging out with one another, they liked it better than what we were previously doing in youth ministry. But man, the conversations were superficial. And I know what it looks like when you're actually breaking through and getting to the heart of somebody in terms of their walk with Christ. And I know when they're staying on the surface. And these young men were staying on the surface, and I was frustrated. So I called up a mentor of mine, and I just started venting to him, and I was like, "This is not working. These young men they're so hard-hearted. uh, I was like, I don't think discipleship is ever going to work on them. I don't really know what would work on them, and I'm ready to just throw in the towel and say the small group is done. And what he said to me is he questioned, he said, "Well, have you won the relationship with them yet?" And I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" And he's like, "Well, what do you do with them?" I was like, "Well, we do Bible study, and sometimes I take them to the Adoration Chapel, and sometimes we try to do some fun activities to start our small group." And he's like, "Yeah, that's not going to work with those guys." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "You got to like win the relationship." Patron saint of youth ministry, Saint John Bosco, he was famous because for juggling, and the juggling tended to attract young people to him, and he built a relationship with them. And he famously said, "If a young person, if they love you, they'll follow you anywhere." He says these young men have no reason to trust you. They have no reason to follow you. They have no reason. He says they really. He says they don't even know if you care about them. You're just trying to run a program with them. So we were going into the summer, and I could change things up in the summer. And so what I said to the my small group is, I said, "Hey, we're going to meet throughout the summer. Um, tell you what, this summer I want you to just meet me for Sunday evening mass, and I okayed this with their families. I said, I want to meet with them for masses on Sunday, make sure that A, they're going, and B, we're going to do our group after mass." And I said, during the summer, instead of doing our regular Bible study, we're just going to go down the street and play mini golf. Because there was this mini golf place down the street from the parish. Um, and I didn't know if we were going to do that the entire summer, but I was like, I'm going to at least do this with them for a few weeks. And uh, so we started doing this. The boys immediately they wanted to put money down, which I was like, sure, I have so much money to spend because I'm a youth minister. But we would put down $5 on a bet um, every week and have a competition with it. And the boys loved it, and it got to be really competitive. And their taunting started to come along, and the guys started to taunt each other throughout the week on, "Hey, I'm going to beat you this week," etc. At the end of it, the first mini golf kind of tournament that we ran with these 5 or 6 boys, um, they one of them said, "Hey, I'm hungry," and there was this Mexican restaurant across the street, which was it had the most disgusting, greasy food I think I've ever seen. I don't think I ever saw a customer in there, but I think it's still open to this day. So we would go across the street and we would grab tacos at this terrible restaurant, and over the for about 3 or 4 minutes. I would crack open the Bible as we ate these tacos, and we would discuss that Sunday's gospel. And that was the religious formation they got on during the summer. We did this every single Sunday from June to August. By the end of the summer, it was like a different group. Um, they they had fun together. We engaged together a lot better. They trusted me a lot more. They were starting to ask questions and really dig in a little bit deeper. They started to get honest about why it was that they were reluctant to get involved and engage in the faith. And it gave me direction so that when we started up again in the fall, we got to go a lot deeper. Um, Winning the relationship is important. I always say, like, if you've got a group of middle school boys and you're meeting with them in a small group, you should be playing for 90% of your time and really just taking the time to win the relationship. I once had a, a group of teenage girls that was meeting with one of my small group leaders. And it's funny to me now because one of the girls that came out of that group became like the archdiocesan director of youth ministry in Denver. And I'm like, I can still remember when you were 15 and you were boy crazy. And I asked my leader, I said, "How's the group going?" She's like, "Oh, it's going great. We have to set aside the first 30 minutes of the small group just to talk about boys." Because that's all the girls wanted to talk about. And she says, and then like for the last 60 minutes, we get into something. Um, but I mean, you've got to take the time to win the relationship. The beautiful thing about once you win the relationship, the build becomes so much easier. Build is all the things that you can get into about faith, all the questions that they have, the Bible studies, forming them in prayer, teaching them about virtue and moral issues. I laugh sometimes when I see youth ministry forums and I see like a youth minister say, "Hey, I'm doing a lesson on apologetics, and I want a creative way to teach this particular teaching. Does anybody have a game that relates to this particular teaching?" And I just laughed to myself because I'm like, "You're doing it wrong. like like it, the dynamic you can take whatever topic you want and create as dynamic a presentation as you want. If you have won a relationship, you don't need to do all that junk. The questions will just come up and they will ask. So if somebody says, how do you teach apologetics to teenagers? I say, I teach apologetics to teenagers because I've taken the time to win the relationship. The questions just naturally come up. I tend to draft my content according to the questions that the, that the teens ask me, and so like to me, it never made sense to say, "Hey, I'm going to teach a lesson on the sacrament of baptism." If I've got teens in a small group that don't even necessarily know if they believe in God, if they don't believe in God, then I'm grabbing Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and I'm doing a book study with Mere Christianity, where he systematically goes through his own walk of faith and the questions that he had, and how he reasoned himself into understanding that God is real and Christianity is the faith that makes the most sense for that. So, like the build portion becomes easier, and you can do all kinds of different things when you start to actually win the relationship. Focus in on what it is that the teens are asking, and then subsequently craft your content accordingly. Um, the final thing I will say though is send the send portion. What does that look like with teenagers? We have to give our young people opportunities to discover their charisms, their God-given gifts, and to utilize them in ways that will build up the church. I discovered I have a speaking for, or I'm sorry, a passion for speaking because I was given an opportunity to speak on retreat weekends when I was a teenager. And I discovered, now I will, I bet if I were to go back in time and watch my presentations, they would probably make me cringe. Like they're not polished. But I discovered a passion for um, that ministry and really subsequently decided to go into ministry, even to discern the priesthood, because I was given this opportunity to discover that I have a gift for this. Um, it was a gift that needed to be refined, but I still discovered I had a gift. We started doing things in our small groups where we would encourage small groups to actively discern together a demographic of people that they have a passion for serving. So we would start to ask the questions like, "Who does your heart break for?" And so you start to discover that a young person in your small group, has a passion for homeless ministry, or ministry for women in crisis pregnancies, or a passion for taking care of young children. Um, and so then we would challenge the small groups to come up with ways as a group to actually serve that demographic of people. I actually did a Advent season where I had like 12 small groups that were meeting on their own in my youth ministry. And I challenged all the 12 leaders. I said, I want you all to come up with a service project that you do together during the season of Advent, where the first week you're discerning who you have a passion for. The second week and the third week you come up with a plan to serve that demographic of people. And then the fourth week of Advent you actually execute it. And we had groups that came up with all kinds of things like taking care of doing lawn work for people that were shut-ins or older, or praying outside of an abortion clinic. I had an all-star girls group that put together an entire mother-daughter Advent tea for the entire parish. And they put together the program. They got fine china. Um, they did um, I think they brought in like a worship leader. They sold tickets outside of mass, and they ended up having like 200 mothers and daughters come to this mother-daughter Advent tea that these teenagers had put together. Meanwhile, my this was at the time when I was leading the small group with a group of punk boys, and I asked them, "Who does your heart break for?" And they said, "Girls." And I was like, "Oh, you punk boys." So then I called him out on it, and I said, "All right, so how are you going to serve girls?" And I said, "And just so you know, we're going to come up with a service project, and here's what this all-star group is doing. They're doing this mother-daughter Advent tea with fine china." And I described the whole thing to them, and I was like, "Guys, how are you going to outdo them?" And one of the teenage boys in my group said, "Are they using fine china like the kind that you have to hand wash?" And I said, "I don't know. They might be." And he says, "Well, I have to do all the dishes after Thanksgiving dinner for our family, and we use fine china, and I have to hand wash the whole thing, and it's really a pain in the butt." He says, so why don't we sneak into the kitchen and do all the dishes for them? And so that's what we ended up doing. Like the girls had put together this whole big program, and at the end of it, they were tired and they were going to have to hand wash all the fine china. And our boys group had snuck in the back of the kitchen and took care of the whole thing for them, and just left a note that said, "We took care of it." Like what a tremendous lesson for the girls and the boys that they got to see, um, like their acts of service and who their heart breaks for. They got to see it in real action, and they got to see like and discover their different charisms and such a thing. Like we need to build up our young people and give them opportunities to serve, and that can be done in small groups and together. All right, all of this to say, okay, best practices in small group ministry. Let's get even more practical. So win, build, send. That's the work that you should be doing in small group ministries. Um, Small groups can be run in a variety of ways. I keep talking about it from the context of a discipleship group, which when I say the word discipleship group, that is a small group that meets on their own for their own activity. It's usually like an hour, hour and a half. The small groups meet all throughout the week, but you can do small groups for anything. Like I know people who do small groups for, they break them out of their youth group. And maybe the small group, they have a large group meeting, but the small groups meet for about 30 minutes of that large group meeting. I know I've seen small groups that break out after a presentation. So you have a parish mission, and then there's small groups that meet afterwards. I know of even if you go to a conference, breaking out into small groups to discuss the conference speaker's presentation. Um, that can be a way to do small groups. So you can utilize small groups in all kinds of different ways. I'll give you a couple of things, pointers on just how to facilitate an effective discussion. The first being that this should be actually it amazes me how much people don't know about just group dynamics. When you're doing and facilitating a small group, everyone should all be sitting or standing on the same level. There is actually a psychology to this, that if there is somebody who is standing and the rest of the group is sitting, the rest of the group will go silent, because the dynamic is that the person who is standing has power over them. You see this in a classroom or at a conference, for example, is that the dynamic is I'm supposed to listen when I'm seated, and the person standing is giving a presentation. So if you have people that are sitting on the floor and others that are in chairs and others that are standing, you're actually inhibiting the discussion in the group. Versus if you have everybody sitting in a chair in a circle facing each other on the same level, that sends the message that this is a discussion and everybody's on the same level in terms of the importance that they bring to the discussion, their opinions, and they're invited to participate. So, so I always try to create an environment where people are circled up, facing each other, sitting on the same level. Second thing to know in terms of best practices, engage critical thinking. Now, I give an entire presentation sometimes on how to ask the right questions in small groups. There's a little bit of an art of learning how to ask the right questions. Uh, One of the things I love about working with young people is that if you ask a bad question, because the goal of a facilitator of a small group is not necessarily to teach, it's actually to get a dialogue going, and then to teach by using what's called Socratic method, by asking the right questions to actually engage a person's critical thinking so that they come up with the right answers. You're not giving it to them. Like the worst thing you can do in a small group is drill somebody on the catechism. Uh, like a small group question that gets discussion going is not, hey, can somebody tell me what are the seven sacraments? That's not a discussion question. You're not engaging critical thinking. Um, One of the things I love about teenagers is if you ask a bad question, one that doesn't engage critical thinking, they will give you blank stares. And so I love that about them because I take that as feedback. If I ever get blank stares from a small group after I've asked a question, I know, oh, I just asked a bad question. I'm not actually getting their critical thinking, their wheels turning. So let me rephrase that question. So, how do you actually engage critical thinking? Turn every question into an opinion question. And what I mean by that is like every person has an opinion about everything all the time. If you think I'm wrong on that, go on to Twitter, now called X, and all you see are millions of people sharing their unsolicited opinions about things that they're not experts on all the time. That's what that social media platform is. It's just unsolicited opinions. And so, how do you get people to actually engage in debate and discussion and dialogue and actually question things and wrestle with and struggle and get a really good discussion going in a small group? Ask their opinion on things. Um, uh, for example, like a blank stare question is, how do you live out the virtue of chastity in your everyday life? You're going to get blank stares from that. A great critical thinking question is to give them a scenario. Hey, your friend Mary's been dating her boyfriend for 6 months. They're both 16 years old, and he says it's time to bring their relationship to the next level intimately. You can guess what that means. She comes to you and asks you for advice. What do you tell her? Um, that's you're asking their opinion in that situation. So in doing so, you're going to get all kinds of different opinions, and you're going to get a dialogue going, and then you can keep asking the question and really getting different people's perspectives. And then eventually, what I do is I'll say, "Let me give you my perspective. Here's what I've learned in my own life, living as a Christian, and here's what I've learned from the guidance of the church." And then I might give them church teaching. Um, I do this kind of critical thinking with anything. One of my favorite things to do is after a speaker talk, a blank stare question is, what was one thing that you pulled out of the speaker's presentation? Blank stares. No one's going to answer that question. Instead, I'll pull out a quote and I'll say, hey, the speaker said this, and I'll say the quote. What do you think he meant by that? Now I just turned it into an opinion question. You can get discussion going by engaging critical thinking. Take some practice, but there are all kinds of resources out there to teach you how to utilize Socratic method. Other best practices: meet in a comfortable environment if at all possible. Even if I'm meeting in like the least comfortable environment for a teenager is a classroom, because a classroom suggests that they're in school and they're there to receive instruction. It's actually an environment that is counterintuitive for what you're trying to do in a small group. I will, if I'm meeting at the parish and I don't necessarily have a comfortable environment that is built, we'll meet on the floor, we'll put the food in the middle, we'll circle up chairs. We'll try to create something that just kind of feels more welcoming and inviting. Honestly, my favorite comfortable environment to meet at is the one pictured there is around a dinner table, around a coffee table, at a coffee house or like a Starbucks. Creating places where like the environment itself is invites discussion. That's the kind of places where like the environment will actually feed the kind of ministry that you're trying to develop. Um, Other points of in terms of best practices: give plenty of time. This is a pet peeve of mine. I once went to a conference where we were sitting at round tables and there was a speaker, and I looked at the schedule, and the speaker was speaking on the subject of homosexuality, which was a great presentation, great topic. They were talking about same-sex attraction, how do we address it in Catholic life, etc. And she gave testimony from her own life, which she was uh, had same-sex attraction. So anyway, the speaker was great. In the schedule for the conference, they had listed 15 minutes of discussion time after the speaker was done talking. The speaker went overtime. And so at the end of it, you had this really hot button topic with tons of great information. And the MC, the facilitator, said, okay, looking at our schedules, you have 7 minutes to talk about this at your table. Go ahead and talk for 7 minutes. And I just looked around my table at the 6 people and I thought, okay, each of us has like roughly 60 seconds to say something. That is not enough time to get a discussion going. At a minimum, you should always leave 20 minutes for small group discussion. So if you're doing a youth group and you're doing a breakout where you have small group times, don't ever short the small group time. That's where the best ministry happens. Um, so at a minimum, you should do 20 minutes. Usually I leave 30 minutes. If I know the discussion is going to be really, really good, I put 45 minutes in my schedule for it. And honestly, like doing small group ministry, I can go an hour and a half easily with my small group. So it's make sure that you give the time in small groups the what it is, afford enough time to actually have good discussion, and so that people can build relationships with one another and you can actually have dialogue. Again, that's where the best ministry takes place. Drives me crazy if I have for example, a youth group night where there's a game and then there's a speaker and then there's small group breakouts, and then there's some sort of prayer activity at the end. Inevitably, the game goes long because the youth minister or somebody wasn't paying attention. The speaker speaks too long because you didn't give them parameters, and you didn't say, hey, you're to speak for 7 minutes exactly, and I'm cutting you off if you go over that. And so at the end of the day, where do they make up the lost time? They cut the small group time down. And then you really lose the best ministry time that you have. The final thing that I will say is best practices involve everyone in the small group. It is not um, uh, it is like not okay for you to have 7 people in a small group and only 3 people do all the talking. I've had small group leaders that walk out of their small group and they say, uh, man, we had a great discussion. And I'll say, okay, what made it a great discussion? Well, this one teen and I just kept having a back and forth. And I'm like, well, it sounds like you just had a one-on-one discussion. But there were 7 people in the small group. Uh, Letting one person dominate the discussion without allowing others to and pulling other people into it is actually it might be really good for that one person, but the other 6 um, are not having an opportunity for their perspective to be heard, for them to be able to ask questions, for their needs to be met. So I make sure to give everybody a time to talk. If I notice somebody is being quiet, I will ask the person, hey, Jacob, do you have any thoughts on this? You're kind of quiet over there. What's your opinion on the subject matter? Like pull people into the discussion and involve everyone. So some of the best practices for small group ministry. I could go on and on and on and on and on. That is my nature. Is that if you wind me up and get me going, I will talk nonstop. Um, but I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for Q&A, um, in which case you might have your own questions about small groups, facilitation, best practices, struggles that you have in terms of your own ministries and need advice. I want to open it up. And Patrick, I'll kind of hand it back to you to facilitate maybe. Um, I don't know if we want people to write in their questions or raise their hands or,
We could do
yeah,
either,
how do
whichever folks are comfortable with. If feel free to raise your hand and we'll ask you to unmute. If you'd rather type your question, you're free to do that, and we'll give you a moment to do that. Um,
I'm just real quick, I'll say I'm willing to bet that those who got on this webinar had some sort of curiosity about small groups. Otherwise, you wouldn't be on the webinar. So I'm hoping that it always takes one person to get us started. So if somebody would be brave enough that has been sitting here with a question related to their own ministry or something that you heard tonight, please get us started, and then we'll just kind of go from there.
what is the biggest fear when you recruit adults to do this? And they're like, I can't do this. I can't sit and have a conversation. Like what's the biggest fear that people express, and how do you help them overcome it?
So there's the work that I'm doing with the 7 parishes that Andrew Ministries is working with right now. The process in the beginning that we work with is actually trying to identify the criteria for the mentors and the small group leaders that we're looking for. Meaning that I had one parish that already sent me their list and their criteria, and they're kind of creating a pool of potential small group leaders. And I said, you can put any 5 criteria you want of like, these are the 5 things I'm looking for in a good small group leader. And I love the fact that they put down that one of their criteria is not weird, meaning they're looking for small group leaders who are not weird. They're not socially awkward. Um, Generally speaking, if I give somebody a structure and a script to get started, and the key is script to get started, and I do some training with them, I don't have a whole lot of people that say, yeah, I'm really nervous on how to get started here. I mean, because when I'm trying to set up a small group for success, and the emphasis is on win the relationship, um, the first thing that I tell them to do is, hey, grab a board game that involves talking with one another. And your first meeting, like meet together and play this card game or this board game, because discussion and conversation just kind of naturally comes up that way. And so really, like, how do you get over your fear of getting a good discussion going? It really comes down to, do you have a relationship with the teens? Um, and so what I'm looking for more than anything in a small group leader is, are they the kind of person that can build a relationship with somebody? And I know that like look, I was in a diocese one time where I was meeting with the presbyteral council of the diocese, which ended up being like a bunch of older priests. And I gave a whole presentation and pitch on small group ministry and why we need to work with young people, etc. And then I said at the end of it, does anybody have any questions? And one of the priests raised his hand and he says, yeah, like, how do you talk to a young person? And I was like, and most of the other priests were like, "Oh yeah, this good. I'm glad you asked that question." I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's where we're at right now." Like I said, the same way you talk to anyone else, honestly. Um, a- and what the priest started to articulate in kind of our back and forth is they thought they're like, "I don't know how to relate to today's generation." And I said, "Yeah, they know that. Like that's okay. If they use language that you don't understand, they will teach it to you."
Mhm.
So all you have to say is like, "Hey, you just used the word skibbity. I don't know what that means. Can you please explain skibbity to me?" Or you keep saying after this one teen complains, "Womp womp." I don't know what that means. Can you please explain it to me? Or you keep talking about memes. What are those? Uh,
Mhm.
and they're more than happy to unpack their world for you and explain it to you, and actually are glad when people get curious. So
Mhm.
it's not as difficult and scary as you might think when you have a little bit of a structure to begin with and some training to begin with. But ultimately, like at the end of the day, I love the fact that people that this one parish said we're looking for people who are not weird and
Mhm.
socially awkward, like people who can actually build a relationship with another person.
Yeah.
And if you know how to build a relationship with another person, teens are not that much different.
Mhm. Thank you. Deacon Column, were you unmuted for a minute? Did you have a question?
Uh, yeah. So we're using Torchbearer Ministries, and they have the model is small groups. Uh, and it's not a didactic model at all. It's about discussion, and it's about hopefully getting the kids to. They pick the topics, and we then if there's unanswered questions, maybe they could go figure out the answers themselves. They have lots of resources themselves. That model, and we have. The kids, it's part in the context of their confirmation preparation. Um, so that's one thing, and then the other aspect of the ministry I'm doing is one of the facilitators for that is also works at the high school, and so in Wayland High School they have a Christian club. So he's volunteered to be the moderator of this Christian club, and they can invite people in to speak. Their clubs meet in the morning because they start school later in the day, like 8:30 instead of 7:30. So their clubs generally meet in the morning. So the leadership group. I'm hoping that they'll come to this Bible study on once a week in the morning, and I'll break them up into small groups. We'll probably have hot chocolate and munchkins, and it'll be a short period of time together, but and obviously totally voluntary. But it's I'm hoping that is my connection with the leadership group. Uh, but I don't know. I mean, when I heard you speak, you were talking about under the bleachers or different places like that. But this would be a more formal connection with the high school because for some reason they sponsor a Christian club, even though it's a public school. So
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so I'm interested in that, and I'm interested also in how to if say 25 kids show up, that's not really mentoring in what you've described, but maybe I could come with other people, and maybe there would be several adults would show up. I'm not sure what the right thing is because it won't be the same kids every week, and when it's exam time, there'd probably be less kids, or near the end of the year, there'll be less kids. All that stuff. So, uh, uh yeah.
I will tell you, at my own parish where I most recently worked, and I'm still a parishioner, our most successful small group was a Bible study that was meeting at the public school at 7 in the morning on Thursdays. That was run by our youth minister. Like You're right, like public schools, it depends on the principal, and you gotta talk to the leadership. But many of them are willing to open their doors to Christian organizations to lead small groups. And we had a coffee shop that was right next to that high school. They would meet at the coffee shop. Very quickly, it became like a 20-person Bible study, which is not a small group anymore, but it was really, really popular. Um, Going and meeting them where they're at on their own turf, uh, bringing food into the middle of it and just trying to build consistent relationships. That can be a great thing, great model. Honestly, Young Life does that a lot. That tends to be their model of ministry, is to get engaged at the high school. Catholic high schools are usually more than happy to open their doors, uh, and public high schools, I found good success with it as well. It can take a little bit of conversations with the leadership there at the schools, and then, if you're looking for them to feed you students, meaning, then you got to kind of come up with a strategy of how we're going to do that. But if you've already got, for example, students that are in confirmation, it's not that hard to say, hey, I'm going to be at your school at Thursday at 6 a.m. or whatever. I'll have donuts. Come visit me. I don't want to be alone. Like, you can even guilt them into it and say, like, guys, we're trying this, and don't leave me hanging. Like, come meet me at the flagpole or something, and bring a friend or something, and then you just consistently do that. You can develop some really good relational dynamics there. So yeah, I don't know if there was ever a question with that, but I've done the same thing and had great success with it.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a go, and the fact that there's a connection at the school is really helpful. And the leadership kids, they meet. I meet with them at the beginning of the year for retreat preparation for the. And then once the retreat's over, then I don't meet with them until Lent again. Just that's how I've done it. But this is a way to continue to see them outside of. I actually think inviting them, like getting them to come to church, is like inviting them to uh, old ladies bingo at the nursing home, and they're not unwilling to do that. That's a good thing to do, play bingo with folks at the nursing home. But that's sort of how they see coming to church. Like that's just the reality. And it's not like they're opposed to it, but they're like, well, I'll do it if you really think it'll help the people there somehow. But so that's going there, going to the school is a good start, and maybe then church, see helping them see that church, yeah, so a broader vision of church, I guess.
You're gonna get me on my soapbox here. So I mentioned, like, comfortable environment is my rule of thumb. Like, you're always trying to create a comfortable environment. And the reason why I gave the examples of kind of where you can meet on the parish grounds is because most parishes are going to meet with their ministries on the parish grounds. That being said, the youth ministries that I build and have run myself, we do very little on the parish grounds. Most of our small groups meet in coffee shops or at their local schools. Because that's where the rule of thumb, like, the most comfortable environment that you can create is meeting on the teenagers' turf, where they literally are comfortable. So their local hangouts, the school itself is their turf. Although I try to avoid the actual classroom at school, like, we will tend to meet in outside or in an all-purpose space or something of that nature, uh, or in the parking lot. Uh, yeah, like a living room environment, a restaurant, a park, things of that nature I find that tends to be a more comfortable environment than anything that I could create at the parish itself.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Thank you.
I'm a fan of that. But again, like, I tried to use the example of, like, because most parishes are going to meet with their groups on parish grounds, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can create comfortable environments there as well.
Okay, thank you.
By the way, in real time, as we're talking about things, anytime somebody talks about a document or a ministry that they're using, Patrick is putting it in the chat box. So he's put up a whole bunch of different things. If you're not in the chat box, I think he put up Torchbearer Ministries in Young Life, and looks like something from Focus Equip, and
Yeah,
there's some
Winbuilt
good,
Send.
yeah,
Yes,
there's
I
some
mean,
good links there.
I think what Deacon Collins describing isn't small group ministry, but it's good relational ministry, or what Young Life would call contact work, that can lead into and become small group ministry. But Dawn had a question, and she was unmuted for a while, and she put it in the chat. how do you go to a place to meet that is not on church grounds? Dawn, you can jump in if you want. I assume this you're asking from like a safe environment perspective, but maybe you want to clarify.
Yeah, yeah, clarify what you mean by that question.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I know the person who was in this role before me, she was very familiar with Young Life, and she was like advocating for meeting on school grounds, and some of the other people were not happy with that idea. So, I mean, that's going to be some sort of a, you know, right now it seems like it's at the church or not. So I'd have to overcome that somehow.
When you say some people, who were some people?
Just other people, when they heard about it, they just, I don't know. So I'm not
Well,
really sure.
are you talking about your parish leadership, or are you talking about parents, or um,
Parents too. Yeah, parents.
okay, okay. So I mean, honestly, like will always advocate for um, do what makes sense for your parish ministry. I mean, if
Hmm.
your parents are like, no, we really would rather the like ministry meets at the parish, then meet at the parish.
Okay.
Um, uh, I think sometimes you use Young Life as an example. Look, Young Life is a tremendous youth ministry that has a tremendous amount of success, and their method is to engage their local schools as much as possible. In part because that's where the young people are. That's where they spend the majority of their time. And while they're at school, they're a captive audience. So I'm always a fan of thinking outside the box and trying to use examples of what other ministries are doing and saying like, hey, it doesn't everything doesn't have to meet at the parish. And so that's kind of where this discussion has gone is like, look, you can meet anywhere you want. And if what works for your parish is meet at your parish, then meet at your parish. But um, I think only putting that as a parameter in terms of a webinar and saying like, guys, everybody should be meeting in small groups at your parish. Don't ever think about outside the box. It's like, no, there's a lot of different ways you can do small group ministries. Meet on grounds, off grounds. Meet primarily at your parish, but once in a while you say, hey, we're going to meet at the bowling alley, or we're going to meet at the soup kitchen, or something of that nature. Those can be really, really good things as well. Is getting out into the community.
Okay.
Bob Doolittle, you're unmuted. Did you have a question for us?
Yeah. Uh, First of all, I'm celebrating. It took me 50 minutes to navigate Zoom and all of that, but
I'll text you the recording when it's available.
I think St. Anthony helped me find you, something like that.
Bob's been doing this for 60 years.
Oh my gosh.
My
That
question is,
might make you the most tenured youth ministry person in the world. You've been doing it for 60 years.
well,
Anyway,
if the
sorry, go ahead.
Diocese of Boston is the world, and sometimes we get that idea. Here's my question. Most of the ministry that I'm doing and have for a while is where the kids are at. It's at confirmation. So you're starting with a captive audience, more or less, and then you're gradually transitioning into, I guess I'm glad I came, but I'm interested in bringing youth ministry, relational ministry, community building into the confirmation preparation context, because that's where they are. And we've had some success there, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. And then one other thing
Sure.
I want to say is that these days it seems like youth ministers are being hired to do confirmation preparation more often than not. And so that's another good reason to give me some good answers.
Sure. So, I mean, let's talk about the elephant in the room. I think most of us know that there are many young people who come to a confirmation program, which exists for the purposes of preparing students to receive the sacrament of confirmation. There are many young people who are coming in and they don't want to be there. Um, and I mean, that's the elephant in the room is that, okay, how do you form somebody who's like, my parents are making me do this? Maybe it's been years, maybe it's been since first communion. The last time that many of them are not going to church. So then, considering that,
few of them
go
are.
ahead.
Put it this way, a few are going to church.
Right. So and then you have the other challenge of you have other young people who are there for the right reasons, or who are going to church, or who genuinely want to learn about their faith and are curious, and they're mixed in with this group that is not on the same page that they are, which makes it really hard to do a program because it's like, okay, I can either minister to the kids who want to be here, and the kids who don't want to be here are going to be just kind of left in the dust, or I'm going to minister to the kids who don't want to be here and really start from the beginning. And subsequently, the kids who want to be there are like, this is beneath me. That is a genuine challenge. Um, so what's the best way, just generally speaking, to facilitate that? This is one of the reasons why I'm a fan of small group ministries. Like, look, the primary method that people utilize still to prepare people for confirmation is a catechist giving instruction. And if you've got kids who don't want to be there, that's not going to help. Like, they don't care what your lesson plan is. They don't want to be in another classroom. That's not going to help. The best thing you can do is facilitate relationships, so that the kids are getting to know the other kids that are with them. You're facilitating dialogue and discussion, um, and uh, and subsequently, it's going to help to bridge that gap. Even more so if you have kids that want to be there with kids who don't want to be there, and you're breaking in, for example, into a small group for discussion. The kids who want to be there might actually start to ask questions that drive that discussion, and kind of pique the curiosity of the kids who don't want to be there. I would be spending as much time as possible in small groups, which means you need a team because you're going to have to break up into groups. And then I would be emphasizing with my small group leaders, spend time building relationships, getting to know these kids, goofing around with them. Because if you just give them a structure of like, here's the lesson plan of what I want you to talk about in the small group, it's going to fall flat. You're going to get a lot of blank stares. Um, at the heart of all ministry, all good ministry is relational. Uh, like, if you think about the ministries perhaps that have had an impact on you, my guess is that there are people that you've met within the church. There are people that are leaders within the church that you've built a relationship with. You've got to try to get things down to a point where it's not just instruction that they're receiving, but it's actually relationships that are being developed. And then from there, the instruction can follow. That's a general principle. I mean, we could talk strategy till we're blue in the face, but I don't know how much time I really have to get into the specifics. I know Patrick would have resources for you, but I would say, like, honestly, for confirmation prep, my first goal is to create relationships with the kids as quickly as possible to try to cut through the junk of I don't really want to be here. It's like, okay, I know you don't really want to be here, so let's talk about it, and actually name the elephant in the room and get into it. I don't know if any of that was helpful, but that's my 2 cents off the top of my head.
Thank you. I think of the orientation that I have is evangelization, which is to say, I want to propose to the kids that Jesus is a real person, and he can actually come and be part of this group, but he stands at the door and knocks. So I have a group of peer leaders, and they take the initiative initially to say, let's light this candle and ask Jesus to come into the room and see what happens. And then to bring stories of ways that he's come through and been responsive to people, so that then the discussion is all off of everybody's comfort zone. In a sense, you're on turf of saying, whoa, what are you telling me? Jesus is really? I used to believe in Santa Claus too. Could we work with that? But then going around, and so everybody is just struggling with, or giving their own stories about, yeah, he's real. So it's not so much like, as a youth minister, I'm more not so much interested in putting across a curriculum as building a community which seeks to know Jesus.
Yeah. Amen. I'm
Yeah.
right there with you. I know Patrick just posted in the chat. He said you can really use almost any confirmation curriculum in a small group format, and then he posted some that are particularly well suited, and he posted two or three different resources in there.
Yeah,
But it's
purpose
true.
confirmation, why disciple, and the UCAT confirmation book. But like, yeah, you can use anything in that format if you wanted to.
Yeah. My goal always with my small group leaders though is to teach them, here's a program, uh, but I want to teach you how to put that program down and actually minister to the people in front of you and build those relationships. Um, so I always say, look, the program is a tool to facilitate discussion. It's not a program that I want you following, saying like, I've got to get through this content and curriculum. Get the dialogue going. I promise you the conversation will be much more fruitful.
Do you use peer leaders?
Uh, yes, if I have when I'm confident in how well formed they have been. So I have historically used peer leaders in confirmation programs before, uh, because I was doing a fair amount of discipleship with those peer leaders. Um, so yeah, I would absolutely use peer leaders if I was also training them and making sure that they were living as disciples themselves.
That is my big concern about, I know lots of places in the Archdiocese like to bring in high school students for the younger grades, and there's nothing wrong with that if you know those young people are disciples themselves and you are in the process of discipling them. Otherwise, it's just a different version of perpetuating people who aren't disciples, teaching people
Well,
who aren't disciples.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's, to that point, like you don't want the blind leading the blind. The very first year that I was a youth minister, this was 2006. I took over at a parish that had no history of youth ministry. So there was a confirmation program where the students got confirmed in ninth grade, and then that was generally it. There was one well-meaning parishioner that would put together a retreat every year using high school students that had been confirmed the year prior. And so I inherited that retreat team, and it was horrific because I got to know these teenagers, uh, and found out that none of them were going to mass on Sunday. They were all partying. They were all using drugs. They were having sex with one another. One had just had an abortion like a few months prior. I mean, it was like I was like, you guys are going to be giving a retreat for these confirmation students?
Yeah.
Are you out of your mind? And so I spoke to the pastor about it. We ended up putting on a retreat. I said, okay, if you want to be on the retreat team, you have to go on a retreat that I'm giving myself with people that I brought in, which was one of the most powerful retreats I've ever done. And then subsequently, when they gave the retreat for the other teens, they gave testimonies about encountering Christ for the first time on the retreat that we did with them. So you have, if you're going to use peer leaders, you have to form them well.
Amen.
Um, yeah, but yes, I'm a fan of peer leaders if you do the work to form them well.
Please don't
Other
hesitate.
questions?
Yeah, please don't hesitate to unmute, put up your hand, put it in the chat. I'll ask another one while we've got a moment. So you get, you get people started, you've recruited them well, you've taught them how to win over the kids. When they get started, either the groups that you've started or with parishes that you work with, what are the most common challenges that come back that you have to help them overcome?
Oh gosh. Uh, I mean, two things is if I've really drilled into the small group leaders, you need to win the relationship, then they tend to try to really focus in on doing activities together and getting to know the teens. Trying to transition that then into actual discussion around the faith um, tends to be a little bit of a challenge for some leaders. They're like, "Hey, we're getting together and we're playing basketball. I don't really know how to segue this into discussions of the faith."
Hmm.
I don't know if that's yeah. And in terms of advice, there, it's like, okay, A, you've got to take your time, but B, you also have to realize that young people are not coming to church to participate in any kind of church thing because it's exclusively like the only thing about it is it's fun. Um, like young people can go have fun anywhere. They don't need to come to the church for that. And so there is a little bit of a fear in getting started of how do I actually start talking about God in this relationship that we're forming together. In which case, I just say you kind of just have to start going for it. Like they do have that expectation. And honestly, like if all you do is fun activities in your youth ministry, which I feel like is what you might have seen in the CYO in the 70s, it's like, okay, eventually they lose interest because uh, all you're doing is fun stuff and they can go anywhere to have fun. Like they're looking for the church to give them meaning and purpose. And so it can be as simple as saying like I'm gonna take our meeting this week and just give my testimony of like how God has moved powerfully in my own life. I'm gonna um, bring them into the chapel and actually start to teach them how to pray. So we'll spend the first 30 minutes shooting hoops, and then we're going to go to the chapel for 30 minutes, things of that nature. So don't be afraid to push the discussion towards faith when you're in that win phase with the teens and just kind of feeling each other out and still getting into relationship. That tends to be one of the things that I hear from leaders quite often is like, how do I actually get them how do I get them to go deeper? In which case, I usually say, if you haven't won the relationship, they won't go deeper. But then once you've won the relationship, you have to be willing to push it deeper. Um, and there's a little bit of feeling out that goes with that.
Thank you. Deacon
Yeah.
Collum, you unmuted. Do you have a question?
No, no, I'm enjoying this. This is good. Thank you. No, I'm not. I'm good.
All right. Rosemary.
Yeah, I have a question. So, Everett, from your experience, how do you discern how long to keep a small group intact? Like perhaps on one side of the equation, it could not be going well and it's just not working. Or conversely, maybe it's borne so much fruit and they've grown so much that they're kind of ready to dive more deeply into their faith or go off and evangelize. Or maybe, for the sake of the parish, you need to kind of change up the dynamic so it doesn't feel cliquey or something like that. So how do you kind of discern all that?
Well, the first thing I'll say, I would never be afraid of cliques so much because if I have capable leaders, I mean, a clique is essentially a, a small group that forms of people that is exclusive, um, and they keep other people out because they have a need that they're trying to meet. Um, and so they become almost hostile to anyone who might be threatening that need that might be being met, like a need for belonging. When you're putting adult leaders in the middle of it and you're helping them to form healthy relationships, that leader can and should be welcoming other people in and helping people to get integrated and helping like the teens to actually um, be the opposite of a clique. Now, if you don't have a leader that is mature and recognizes that as their role, then cliques could form. In which case, you got to pull the leader aside and be like, "Dude, you're forming a clique. Like, that's not what you're supposed to be doing here." Um, so, the other thing I'll say is that one of the hardest things to know about small groups is there is no exact science to putting them together. If you're doing, for example, in a youth group setting, you have breakouts where like part of the meeting is a teaching and then part of it is discussing that teaching in small groups. I would strongly recommend that they're in the same small groups every week. Because if they're in a different small group, for example, where they're with different teams, you're never going to develop the kind of relationships that actually drive the discussions to go deeper. With that, however, is you've got to, as a leader, be talking to your small group leaders regularly and feeling out like how is it going? Because I have had plenty of times where I put a really capable leader with a really amazing group of teens, and it just didn't work. And then I changed out the leader and it worked perfectly fine. Or I changed out the teams and it worked perfectly fine. And because there is no exact science to saying like, hey, I'm going to put people together, now be friends. Like you can't force friendship and like I had one example of I had uh, two adult leaders, young adult leaders, so Catholic young adults in their 20s, with a group of teenage girls who were awesome girls and really curious about their faith and tended to be more leaders in the parish. And they just did not mesh. Like what I didn't realize was the adult leader was really into sports and athletic and outdoor stuff, and and the girls were really into like girly things, like hanging out, talking, chatting, doing nails, etc. Um, and their relatability just didn't work. Like they just could not get on the same page, and the chemistry wasn't right. And as soon as I changed the leader, which there was nothing wrong with the leader I had in the group, but as soon as I changed the leader, the group was fine. So I would always say like groups should meet as long as they're fruitful. Like I have groups that have met for 6 or 7 years. Like they continue to meet through college, which is awesome. But I don't ask that of my volunteers. I don't say, hey, I want you to commit to this ministry for the next 7 years of your life. Um, but you know, if the ministry is fruitful, it should continue to meet. If it's not fruitful, it's probably, especially if it's not fruitful in the beginning, it might be because the dynamics of the group are not right, and there's just no exact science. Sometimes you have to say, hey, um, these four teens in the group seem to really mesh well together, but two of them don't talk at all. Maybe these two teens would be more comfortable in another group. And so you just talk to them and say, would you be more comfortable in another group? And try to move people around.
Good
It's
question
like,
from Dawn. She
how
says,
do you,
how do you take away the expectation of knowing the faith within a certain time frame?
uh, talk to your pastor. So I am an advocate that what I'm trying to create and develop are people who will be lifelong disciples. And catechesis and knowing the faith is something that it's a journey. Uh, you know, like I understand the need, particularly when you're preparing for a sacrament, to know certain things. Um, but you have to realize too that you could have a young person in your group that struggles with the existence of God, and that doesn't change overnight. Heck, my father-in-law wrestled with the existence of God for 20 years. I worked on him for 20 years, and slowly walked with him and accompanied him. Uh, the attitude that you need to have to be look, if you have content and curriculum that you need to hit in order to prepare somebody for a sacrament, I understand that, and you've got to hit those points, and there are a variety of ways to do so, and a variety of curriculums I could recommend. But I will say that the attitude I recommend having if you're going to do youth ministry or evangelization or discipleship is that of somebody who's trying to execute a magic trick for 30 years. There's a great movie. Uh, Great is a subjective term in this case, but it's called Now You See Me, which is basically a like an Ocean's 11 meets Magicians movie. So it's kind of ridiculous. It's like these magicians who rob banks, but it's an entertaining movie. It was out several years ago, and in it they have all these magicians talking behind the scenes, and there's like a community of magicians, and there's a famous magician that they keep referring to named Lionel Shrike. Oh my gosh, Patrick just put the name of the movie in the chat, so there you go. It's called Now You See Me. They refer to this magician by the name of Lionel Shrike, and I pulled this story out because I thought it perfectly uh, exhibits the kind of attitude you need to have to be successful in ministry. There was a magician that as a teenager, uh, like a politician came to town, and he did a card trick for the politician, and did sleight of hand and made the card disappear or whatever. But the goal of the trick was not to impress the mayor or the politician. It was to get the guy's signature on a card. So he had him sign the card, and then he made the card disappear or something. And then once the politician walked away, and really he wanted the trick to be forgettable, he took that card with the guy's signature and he put it into the knot of a tree. And over the course of 30 years, that tree, the knot closed, and that tree grew with the card in the middle of it. And then that same politician came back 30 years later, and again he asked if he could do a card trick with him. And at this point, he had long forgotten that he had signed this card 30 years ago. And using sleight of hand, he made sure that he pulled out the exact same card that he did 30 years prior. He signed it in the exact same place. And then using sleight of hand, he made it disappear. And he said, your card is now in the middle of that tree. And he had them cut down that tree. And everybody was amazed. It was legendary. They said, how in the world did he get this card literally growing in the middle of this tree, not realizing that it was the card from 30 years prior. So he had this plan and this idea to see this card trick through for 30 years. Like, that's the attitude you have to have when you're accompanying somebody in ministry. Um, so I get the idea of like, hey, like there's an expectation of knowing the faith, but honestly, if you're ever going to be successful in anything in ministry, accompaniment of just being willing to walk with somebody at their own pace, um, and being willing to walk with somebody and journey with them for 30 years to see it through, um, that's the kind of attitude you have to have if you're really going to be successful in ministry. Uh, so that's like the best answer I can give to that question is, yeah, I get it. Like, okay, meet your bullet points in terms of what you need to cover, but please go into ministry with the attitude of saying, like, I'm here to accompany you and walk with you at your own pace for 30 years if I have to. Uh, that kind of attitude will contribute to success in ministry. I don't know if that's a good answer to the question, but that's the answer I'm going to give you.
Tell that to your pastor.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, in all honesty, like there are three people I can name in my life that have been formative to me and have taught me the most of the stuff that I know about ministry. And that's and one person in particular, Bob Kloska. I've known him since I was 18 years old now. We just had dinner a few weeks ago. And he lives in Indiana. I live in Colorado, but like our paths still cross. He still calls me. We still talk. Um, so he has a 30-year attitude with me, and still accompanies me to this day. I actually wrote a book on this. It's called One Disciple at a Time. So Patrick, you can put that up in the chat box there.
Oh, I did already, but I will put it back.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Yeah, we got 60 seconds, so this might actually be a good place to end. Look, like the attitude. That's the attitude that Christ had with the apostles. Is I'm going to walk with you and accompany you, even if it takes years. I'm not going to look. I will say that frequently Jesus withholds information from the apostles and allows them to go at their own pace, rather than explaining everything to them all at once. Uh, so don't be restricted by like I've got to make sure that they know all of these things. That would be my encouragement.
Thank you very much for taking the time. Deacon Colum, were you still with us, or did you? Looks like he left. I was going to ask him to give us his blessing. But Bob, you're still unmuted. Would you close us in prayer?
Yes. Oh, Jesus, you've been with us the whole time, and thank you very much for coming to us through Everett. My prayer is that the little moments in listening to him, when a phrase or a word has come through and has hit home, that you would help us capture those, nurture those, so that they sprout and bear fruit. And we thank you for this way that you've had of encouraging us. Thank you, Jesus, and we also pray to the Father in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Everett. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.